Australia and China are nearly 5,000 miles apart. But in the last 20 years, the two nations have become far more connected than anyone could have imagined. Every year, Australia exports around $200 billion worth of products to China. And in the last 2 decades, over 1.2 million Chinese citizens have travelled to Australia to study or set up home. On the surface, this is a partnership which has been enormously lucrative for both countries, creating jobs and fostering economic growth. Yet behind the scenes lies a different reality. Australia's partnership with China has secretly been crippling their economy, affecting everything from education to housing. This may seem strange at first. Australia's GDP per capita is 5 times more than China's, and it's a far richer country. But what started as a lucrative opportunity for Australia has transformed into a crippling dependence on the world's second largest economy. In 2024, over a third of Australia's exports went to China, more than to Japan, India, South Korea, and even the United States combined. Across the country, entire industries and millions of jobs depend on Chinese trade. Even Australia's universities lean heavily on Chinese students to keep their doors open, and property in many of Australia's busiest cities is being squeezed by outside investment. But this is just the start. Key ports, mines, agricultural land, water and energy companies, and even state-sponsored schools are owned by Chinese interests, providing not just an economic risk, but leverage and influence for the Chinese state. Meanwhile, Chinese buyers dominate the property market, spending over $93 million a day on prime real estate. Today, almost every aspect of Australian life now has Chinese influence, even down to paying with Afterpay. But as the Chinese economy slows, one thing is becoming clear. This partnership hasn't made Australia better off, it has made it poorer and more vulnerable. So how did this happen? And is there anything Australia can do to save its economy from this crippling addiction? Aside from making Australia poorer, this also places them at the mercy of the largest effective dictatorship in the world. This isn't easy for many Australians to stomach, but it wasn't always like this. In fact, there once was a time when China was reliant on Australia. To see how a relationship which appears so lucrative is slowly breaking the country, we first need to go back in time. By the year 2000, things in China were changing. Gone were the days of hardline communist policies, and the country was beginning to open to the world, accepting foreign investment, encouraging private business, and setting the stage for one of the most rapid economic transformations in human history. Over the course of 40 years, it went from a third world country, on par with some of the poorest in the world, to today a wealthy developed nation. This process of modernization created an insatiable demand for raw materials: steel for skyscrapers and bridges, coal for power plants, and natural gas for heating homes and fueling industry. But there was one problem. These were resources which China did not have readily available. But there was one country that could help: Australia. They were already riding the high of a mining and extraction boom which began in the 1960s. Blessed with large natural resource deposits and the infrastructure to export them, the Australian economy was perfectly placed to accommodate this newfound demand, and the two countries quickly became partners. Australia dug up their minerals, shipped them off to China, and in return, billions of dollars poured into the Australian economy. What followed was an economic boom. GDP per capita soared, putting Australia ahead of many of its developed world peers. Cities like Perth and Brisbane became bustling hubs for the mining industry, and thousands of jobs were created, both directly in the mines and indirectly in supporting industries like logistics and engineering. As time went on, this trade relationship continued, and more of the Australian economy was centred on exporting minerals to China. By 2024, well over 1 in 3 of Australia's exports were heading to China. And today, the Australian economy is in a unique position amongst developed nations of the world. Most major economies like the United States or the UK rely on selling services, things like financial and legal advice to drive their economy. But Australia is a little different. Their service sector is underdeveloped. Only around 60% of their outputs come from selling services like this. This may sound like a lot, but it is significantly lower than other countries. In the UK, 83% of output comes from services, and in the US it's well over 70%. Instead, the Australian economy has relied on exporting resources, energy, and agricultural produce to foreign countries, primarily China. But China's influence over Australia isn't just economic. Just a few weeks ago, Chinese warships circled Australia, sparking panic in their government. But depending on the source, this could be framed as a serious threat or just another routine patrol. This is why, once again, I use ground news to provide me with coverage that cuts through all the noise and tells me what's really happening. With 50,000 news sources feeding into the website, app, and email updates, I can filter stories by factuality, bias, and location, allowing me to instantly compare how different outlets report on a topic. With Chinese warships, I saw a right-wing outlet call the Australian left-wing PM out of his depth, while this Chinese-owned site described the submarine's presence as merely a circuit around the island. Without knowing the ownership and motives behind these outlets, spotting bias would be way harder. And that's why I also use their blind spot feature every day to make sure I'm getting a wide range of news that is often left out by media outlets on both the left and the right. Something which is so important today as the world is becoming even more polarised. If you want to stay ahead and cut through the noise, you can scan the QR code on screen or head to ground.news/invisible to get 40% off the Vantage plan. It's what I use to get unlimited insights into global news, and I highly recommend it. Click the link in the description to learn more. Now let's get back to looking at Australia's economic relationship with China. For a while, this worked well. And in the 30-year period from 1990 to 2020, Australia's economy didn't have one full-blown recession. Even if other sectors faltered, exporting goods to China protected the economy. Australia achieved the remarkable feat of escaping the savings and loans crisis of the 90s, the dot-com bubble of the 2000s, and even the 2008 financial crisis. As China transformed into a global superpower, Australia thrived by riding the wave of its success. This momentum seemed unstoppable, until it wasn't. An aging population, declining exports, and a struggling real estate sector have slowly been crippling the Chinese economy. In 2024, estimates suggest it only grew by 2.8%. This by no means a bad pace, but well below its double-digit growth rates of the past 20 years. And while this is bad for China, it is especially problematic when your future success has been underpinned by these growth rates. And nowhere is the impact of this slowdown being felt more than in Australia. Exports to China, once the backbone of the economy, are in freefall. $100 billion is expected to be lost in just the next 4 years alone, cutting export revenues by a quarter. For context, when the UK left the EU, this figure was only around 6%. This has already had crushing effects on the mining and agricultural sectors, two pillars of the Australian economy. But unfortunately for Australia, this is just the beginning. Polling has indicated that more than half of companies would cut jobs if exports to China fell, especially in resource-heavy regions. And when you look at a map of Australia, you realise these are everywhere. Take Pilbara, located in Western Australia. It is almost entirely centred around resource extraction. Over half of the jobs in the region come from mining iron, and of all the mining done in the area, almost 80% is sold to China. But this is just one of many, and it doesn't take long to realise this is a nationwide problem. The Barwon region sells dairy products, of which 40% goes to China, and these towns are littered across the country, where sometimes up to 70% of exports goes to China. The once golden trading opportunity has turned from a blessing to a curse. But while Australia opened up trade with China, it also exposed itself to another vulnerability. Money flowing from China has also been drastically changing another aspect of Australian life. Their economic boom has created a new social group, the investor class. Owners of enormously profitable Chinese businesses looking for new regions to invest and grow their wealth. Their solution? Australia. The nation was perfect. It already had well-developed institutions to support these investors and wasn't plagued by political instability. Plus, it was also much nearer than other Western nations, which gave it another advantage, but more on that later. Chinese investors flocked to Australia, taking billions of dollars of investment with them. Since the 2008 financial crisis, China has invested over $153 billion in Australia, meaning many Australian companies are in some cases entirely Chinese owned. Take Energy Australia. The company provides electricity and natural gas to nearly 2 million customers across the country, dominating 15% of the market share. Equally, Port Darwin, one of the largest and most strategically significant ports in the country, is also Chinese owned. Escaping this influence has become practically impossible for the average citizens. The profits of almost any product, good or service which is bought will go in part to China, the result of decades worth of Australian firms selling their assets for a quick profit. And this ultimately comes at the expense of the country's wealth. By sending profits abroad, it is China, rather than Australia, that is getting rich from the industry. But it's not only companies which Chinese buyers are interested in, but property too. In a typical year, the nation will invest upwards of $3.5 billion in Australian real estate, more than the next 10 countries combined. This influx of Chinese buyers is raising the cost of buying and renting homes, squeezing the budgets of normal Australian families. Take an area like Toorak, a picturesque suburb located in the heart of Melbourne. In the last 6 months, all major sales in the area were to Chinese buyers, and in many parts of the country, prices have been pushed up to the point where locals can no longer afford to live there. As China developed into an economic powerhouse, it wasn't just the investor class that was booming, but the middle class. Thousands of Chinese families who wanted better opportunities for their children looked to Australia. The nation is home to some of the best educational institutions in the world. Places like the University of Melbourne and the Australian National University attract the best and brightest students from across the country, providing them with the skills needed to enter high-paying, productive jobs. This international status means they're not only attractive destinations for top Australian students, but foreign nationals as well, particularly those from wealthy backgrounds seeking a distinguished education. The number of international students has grown dramatically since the turn of the century. Currently, the country hosts around 820,000 international students, of which around a quarter are Chinese. It's worth bearing in mind that the population of Australia is still relatively small, at 26 million people. This means that 1 in every 28 people in Australia are international students. In addition to this, international students pay significantly higher fees. While home student fees are capped at $14,000, for international students it can cost up to $50,000 per year. In the short term, this seems like a great deal. Australian universities can make some extra cash at the expense of Chinese students, while Australian nationals can enjoy the same education for a lower cost. But there's a problem. International students paying higher fees encourages universities to accept international students over Australian applicants, and every place filled by an international student is one missed out on by an Australian citizen. This trend is particularly evident at the top universities, which have international rates which in some cases climb as high as 45%. The massive influx of these students is harming the quality of the education available to Australian citizens. What's more, close to 90% of international students who study in Australia do not stay in the country long term. This is significantly higher than in most developed countries, like Canada or the US, where approximately half of international students stay in the country. This is strange. A loss of talent at this scale usually only occurs in developing countries, where highly skilled workers leave in search for better opportunities abroad. However, Australia's unique relationship with China has led to a similar crippling effect. This dominance has meant that the valuable skills taught at university, crucial for building a dynamic, service-based economy, are not retained in Australia. Instead, international students return home after education at Australia's top universities, taking their skills with them. It is these skills which, in the face of slowing exports to China, the country needs to shift towards. But due to heavy reliance on international students, the economy may find itself short-staffed to pull off such a transition. And it's not just businesses and the education sector that have become dependent on Chinese buyers, but also Australia's own government. Throughout China's economic boom years, Australia's government generated huge amounts of revenue through taxing exports to China. Money which the government uses to pay for healthcare, education and its military. But just like businesses, this reliance has left the Australian government at the mercy of Chinese economic performance. As the Chinese economy slows, tax revenue is projected to be reduced by $8.5 billion per year. For context, Australia's total defence spending is only $34 billion. To fill this rapidly emerging black hole, the government will either need to raise taxes or cut spending. But both of these are highly unattractive prospects, especially at a time of job losses. And as unemployment rises in industries like mining and agriculture, more people will demand welfare support. This creates a dangerous double-edged sword. The dual impact of reduced revenue and higher welfare demands poses a risk for economic stability, which the country has enjoyed for the past 30 years. At best, it will slow the economy to a halt, and at worst, push Australia into a full-blown recession. What started as a golden opportunity, a partnership that brought wealth, jobs, and growth, has turned into a precarious reliance on a single growing economy. From mining and agriculture to education and infrastructure, almost every corner of Australian life is tied to China in some way. And while this relationship has undoubtedly shaped modern Australia, it's also left the country vulnerable, and the cracks are starting to show. Job losses, budget shortfalls, and a lack of control over critical industries are all warning signs that this dependency isn't sustainable. With all of this in mind, this is by no means a lost cause. Australia is still one of the richest countries in the world, and it has a range of options. Diversifying trade partners, investing in emerging industries, and focusing on keeping skilled talent at home are just a few steps the country can take to break free from this over-reliance. And with the right economic policy, the nation can shift away from its current trajectory. But given the current path of the government over the last 20 years, this seems unlikely.